The question. For 2 episodes now, the same question has been waiting in the room with us. Episode 8 asked it directly. What is consciousness? That it can be assembled at all, or unestablished at last. Last time, in a quieter conversation about joy, the same question returned in different clothes. What is consciousness itself? That it can be trained at all. Tonight, the series takes its most direct approach to the question both episodes were circling. Something is happening right now that science cannot explain. Not something unusual, not a near-death experience, not a special state, not anything exotic at all. Just this, the experience of reading these words, the felt quality of what it is like to hear a voice, the sense, quiet, continuous, ordinary, of being present in this moment. Notice it for a moment, not the content of what you are thinking, the bare fact that any of it is being experienced at all. There is a difference between a brain processing information and a brain having an experience of processing information. Cameras process light. Thermostats process temperature. We do not usually say there is something it is like to be a thermostat, but there is, almost certainly, something it is like to be you, right now, sitting where you are sitting. That difference between processing and experience, between information and felt life, is what the philosopher David Chalmers, in 1995, named the hard problem of consciousness. And after 30 years of active research, the hard problem remains unsolved. The paper that named it appeared in 1995 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. Chalmers, then a young Australian philosopher, drew a line through the field of consciousness research. On one side, what he called the easy problems. He's explaining how the brain discriminates between stimuli, how it integrates information from different senses, how it reports on its own internal states, how it accesses its own memories, how it focuses attention, how it controls behavior, how it tells waking from sleep. He listed 7 of them in the paper. He called them easy, not because they are simple to solve. Solving any one of them requires decades of work, but because each one yields, in principle, to the standard methods of cognitive science. Each is the kind of problem that more neuroscience eventually will answer. And on the other side, the hard problem.
In Chalmers' own words, the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience.
When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there is also a subjective aspect. As Nagel has put it, there is something it is like to be a conscious organism. This subjective aspect is experience. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. 3 years after publishing that paper, in 1998, Chalmers attended a neuroscience conference in Bremen, Germany, and there he made a bet with the neuroscientist Christof Koch, one of the most respected scientists working on consciousness. Koch bet that the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain mechanisms that produce experience, would be discovered within 25 years. Chalmers bet that they would not. The bet was settled on June 23, 2023, at a conference in New York City. Chalmers won. The neural correlates of consciousness have still not been identified. Afterward, when he was asked about it by Neuron, he said something easy to miss. "I'm an eternal optimist, and I think the problem is solvable one way or another." He believes the problem is solvable, but it hasn't been. And the same year he won that bet, 2023, 124 consciousness researchers signed an open letter calling the leading brain-based theory of consciousness pseudoscience. This is the state of the science of consciousness in 2026. The wall is precisely named, and it has not moved. That's the first thing this episode wants to put in front of you. The second is what the Pali Canon has to say about the same question, approached from a completely different direction. We'll get there. But first, the wall itself. Because in order to understand why the canon's silence at the boundary is interesting, you have to first see exactly where science has stopped and why. Chapter 1. The Wall. The term Chalmers used for the wall, and the term we'll keep coming back to in this episode, wasn't his own. It came from a 1983 paper by the American philosopher Joseph Levine, titled Materialism and Qualia, the Explanatory Gap. Chalmers credits Levine for it on page 203 of his 1995 paper, in the same sentence where he names the wall. We know that conscious experience does arise when these functions are performed, but the very fact that it arises is the central mystery. There is an explanatory gap, a term due to Levine, between the functions and experience, and we need an explanatory bridge to cross it. It matters that the term is Levine's, not Chalmers, because Levine and Chalmers use it differently. Levine was, and is, a materialist. He believes consciousness is, ultimately, physical. He coined explanatory gap to name a challenge to his own position. Even if we knew every physical fact about a brain, we would still seem to face a gap between that physical description and the fact of experience. For Levine, this is an epistemological problem, a problem about what we can know, not a refutation of materialism. He writes that the gap does not entail that materialism is false. Chalmers takes the same gap and pushes harder. He uses it as a premise in a metaphysical argument. Because physical descriptions never entail experiential facts, experience cannot be merely physical. Same term, different philosophical move. The gap belongs to Levine. The anti-physicalist use of it belongs to Chalmers. Worth knowing, because in a moment, we'll see that the two of them are not the only ones standing at this wall. For 30 years now, there have been serious attempts to bridge that gap. To explain, not just describe, how physical processes produce experience. 4 of those attempts are worth knowing in this episode, because each one shows the same shape of failure. Each one explains something real, and then, in each case, the hard question returns in a slightly new form. The first is global workspace theory. Developed by the psychologist Bernard Bars in the late 1980s and elaborated by the neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene in the years since, it proposes that consciousness arises when information is broadcast across a wide network of brain regions. Dehaene's formulation: consciousness is global information, broadcasting within the cortex. When a thought becomes accessible to working memory, to language, to deliberate action, when many regions of the brain can suddenly talk about it, that according to the theory is what consciousness is. It's a careful theory. It maps onto experimental data. It tells us which contents will become available to report and which will not. But here's what Chalmers asked, back in 1995. Even if this is so, nothing internal to the theory explains why the information within the global workspace is experienced. The best the theory can do is to say that the information is experienced because it is globally accessible. But now the question arises in a different form. Why should global accessibility give rise to conscious experience? As always, this bridging question is unanswered. The theory tells us which contents become conscious. It does not tell us why broadcasting is felt. The gap is unmoved. The second is integrated information theory. Proposed in 2004 by the Italian-American neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, it makes a more ambitious claim. Consciousness is integrated information. The quantity of consciousness in any system can, in principle, be measured. Tononi calls it phi, the Greek letter phi. Where phi is high, consciousness is high. Where phi is zero, there is no experience at all. Integrated information theory is mathematically elegant. It also has unsettling consequences. Any system with phi greater than zero, any system that integrates information in the relevant way, has some consciousness, however minimal, including, in principle, systems we would not normally think of as conscious at all. Christof Koch, the same Koch who lost the 2023 bet to Chalmers, has publicly embraced this implication, a position close to what philosophers call panpsychism, the idea that consciousness, in some primitive form, is everywhere matter integrates information. In 2023, the situation came to a head. In June, an adversarial collaboration between proponents of integrated information theory and proponents of global workspace theory announced its results at a conference in New York, the same conference where Chalmers collected on his bet. The two theories had been tested against each other in carefully designed experiments. Neither won decisively. The field declared itself at an impasse. 3 months later, on September 15, 2023, a public letter appeared on the preprint server Sci-Archive, signed by 124 researchers, including some of the most prominent names in neuroscience and philosophy of mind, like Patricia Churchland, Daniel Dennett, Joseph Ledoux, and Bernard Bares himself, the founder of the rival theory. It called integrated information theory pseudoscience. Its objection, the theory's panpsychist implications and its lack of testability. Chalmers called the letter dropping a nuclear bomb over a regional dispute. Philip Goff and Anil Seth publicly defended the theory. The argument continues. The point for this episode isn't who is right. The point is the shape. Integrated information theory predicts which systems will be conscious and to what degree. It does not explain why integration should feel like anything. The gap is still there. And even consciousness science cannot agree on what counts as a theory of consciousness in the first place. The third response is more radical. In 1989, the British philosopher Colin McGinn published a paper in the journal Mind with the title, "Can We Solve the Mind-Body Problem?" His answer was, probably not. Not because the problem is unsolvable in principle, but because human cognition is not equipped to solve it. McGinn introduces a concept he calls cognitive closure. A type of mind is cognitively closed with respect to a property if the concept-forming procedures available to that mind cannot reach that property. The example he uses is biological. Just as the cognitive equipment of a dog cannot reach the concept of calculus, not because calculus is supernatural, but because a dog's brain isn't built for it, the natural property that explains how matter produces experience may simply lie outside the cognitive reach of Homo sapiens. The problem is not mystical. It is fully natural. We just happen to be the wrong kind of animal to solve it. McGinn calls his position naturalistic, but not constructive. Consciousness is part of nature. The explanation of consciousness is not part of what we can construct. The irony, and McGinn is aware of it, is that the very quality of mind that allows him to name this limit is the quality he is claiming we cannot explain. A mind that knows where it cannot reach is already further along than a dog with calculus. But McGinn's point survives the irony. Knowing that there is something beyond your cognitive grasp is not the same as grasping it. His position has earned a name in the literature: Mysterianism. It may not be a satisfying answer, but it has the same shape as the others, in a sense. It concedes that the gap, by ordinary methods, will not close. The fourth response is the most counterintuitive. In Galileo's Error, published in 2019, the British philosopher Philip Goff makes the case for panpsychism, the view that, in his words, consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of physical reality. Not just in brains, not just in animals, in everything that exists, in some form, however minimal. An electron, a grain of sand, a star. None of these would have experience anything like ours. There would be no thought, no perception in any organized sense. But each, on this view, would have some primitive flicker of being something on the inside. Panpsychism dissolves the hard problem rather than solving it. If consciousness is already fundamental, already part of the basic furniture of the universe, like mass and charge, then there is no question of how physics produces it. It's there from the start. The brain doesn't generate experience. It organizes experience that is already, in some primitive form, everywhere. It's a position that is intellectually honest about one thing. If you find the gap between mechanism and experience unbridgeable, one option is to stop trying to bridge it and treat experience as basic. Panpsychism has been gaining sympathetic attention in academic philosophy for exactly this reason. Not because anyone has new evidence for it, but because the alternatives have not closed the gap. Now, here we need to pause for a distinction that matters for the rest of the episode. Chalmers and Goff are sometimes lumped together. They are not the same. Chalmers' own position, going back to his 1995 paper, is what he calls naturalistic dualism. Experience, he proposes, may be a fundamental property of nature, alongside mass and charge, connected to physical processes by what he calls bridging laws. This is, as he puts it, an innocent version of dualism, entirely compatible with the scientific view of the world. Not Cartesian souls, just experience as a basic property, connected to brains by laws we have not yet discovered. Goff's panpsychism goes one step further. It says experience is not only fundamental, but everywhere. Chalmers has discussed panpsychism in his book, The Conscious Mind, and elsewhere, fairly sympathetically. But in his own words, in a 1998 interview, "I'm not committed to the idea." His more recent work has explored idealism, the view that mind, not matter, is the fundamental reality, but again, without commitment. Chalmers names the wall. He has not declared what is on the other side. That distinction matters because we are about to walk into the Pali Canon. And in popular treatments, the Buddhist view of consciousness is sometimes filed alongside panpsychism, as if the two were natural cousins. They are not. Let me say that clearly before we go any further. Panpsychism says consciousness is fundamental to all matter. Consciousness is a basic feature of reality, present everywhere, in some primitive form. The Pali Canon, in the suttas we are about to look at, says something structurally different. Consciousness, vijnana, is dependently arisen, MN 38. It appears in dependence on conditions. Without those conditions, it does not appear. It is not a substance that pervades reality. It is a process that arises when conditions sustain it. The Buddha will use the image of a fire to make this point. A fire is not a substance hiding inside wood, waiting to come out. It is what happens when wood, oxygen, and heat meet. Change the conditions, change the fire. Remove the conditions, no fire at all. That view is neither materialism which says the physical produces the mental as a one-way causal output, nor panpsychism, which says the mental is fundamental and ubiquitous. It is a third thing. We will see exactly what kind of third thing in the next chapter. For now, the four theories taken together have the same shape of failure. Each one explains something real about consciousness, how it is broadcast, how it integrates, how it might be cognitively beyond us, how it might be fundamental. And then the hard question reappears in a new form. Why does any of this feel like anything? The gap remains. Science has named it precisely. And for 30 years now, around that named gap, there has been a kind of silence. The canon, as it turns out, has its own silence around the same territory. Not a silence of failure, a silence of a different kind. That is what we turn to next. Chapter 2: Varela's Bridge. Among the people who have stood at this wall, one figure is worth pausing on at greater length. Because what he proposed was not another theory of consciousness. It was a different kind of move altogether. And the move he proposed is the one that connects this episode's two halves. Science on one side, the Pali Canon on the other. His name was Francisco Varela. He was a Chilean biologist trained at Harvard. He spent his career working at the intersection of cognitive science and what philosophers call phenomenology, the study of experience from inside. He had also been, for many years, a serious student of Buddhist contemplative practice. In 1987, together with the lawyer Adam Engel, Varela helped found something called the Mind and Life Institute, a forum that brought senior scientists into sustained, structured conversation with the Dalai Lama and other contemplative teachers. Not photo-op meetings, multi-day working dialogues, transcribed, published as books, returned to and refined over decades. The Institute is still running today. If you have read any serious popular literature on meditation and neuroscience over the last 30 years, Daniel Goleman, Richie Davidson, John Kabat-Zinn, most of it traces back, directly or indirectly, to that channel of conversation. By the time he died in 2001, Varela had spent decades trying to put first-person investigation and third-person science into honest contact with each other. The 1996 paper was his most direct theoretical statement of how that should be done. In 1996, Varela published a paper in the same journal where Chalmers had published the previous year, the Journal of Consciousness Studies. The title was direct: Neurophenomenology, a methodological remedy for the hard problem. He took Chalmers' framing seriously. He agreed that experience is a real, irreducible field of phenomena, not a side effect, not an illusion. He agreed that no third-person theory was likely to bridge the gap by itself, but he disagreed about what to do next. The way out, he thought, was not to wait for a better theory. It was to change the method. In his own words, from the paper's abstract, there is no theoretical fix or extra ingredient in nature that can possibly bridge this gap. Instead, the field of conscious phenomena requires a rigorous method and an explicit pragmatics for its exploration and analysis. Read that carefully. He is not saying the hard problem has been solved. He is saying, explicitly in his own writing, that no theoretical fix can close it. What he proposes is not a solution. It is a different way of working. Here is what that different way of working looks like in practice. Train subjects in disciplined first-person observation, drawing on the methods of phenomenological philosophy which had been developing since Husserl in the early 20th century, and on Buddhist contemplative practice, which had been developing for considerably longer? Have them learned to notice the structure of their own experience with more precision than untrained introspection allows? Have them produce structured accounts of what they observe, then, simultaneously, record the activity of their brains while they do this, and let the two sets of data discipline each other. Where the first-person report becomes more precise, let it constrain the neural data. The third-person observations have to fit what the trained subject is actually reporting. Where the neural data shows something the subject did not notice, let it constrain the first-person account. The introspector has to refine what they are looking for. Mutual constraints, first-person and third-person, iteratively shaping each other. Not one trumping the other. Not Buddhism handing modern neuroscience the answer. Not neuroscience explaining away contemplative experience. Each one making the other more rigorous over time. To put it concretely, in some of the studies Varela ran in the late 90s, subjects watching simple visual patterns were trained to report, with greater precision than usual, the moment a pattern resolved into recognition, the moment of, "I see it now." Those finely timed first-person reports were then matched against simultaneous EEG recordings. Brain signatures that would have been invisible against ordinary untrained reports became visible when the reports themselves became sharper. The first-person discipline made the third-person measurement more sensitive. And the third-person measurement, in turn, made it possible to ask the introspector, "Did you notice this? What was happening just before?" The two sides held each other accountable. That is what Varela proposed. Not a theory of consciousness, a different methodology for investigating it. Now, here we have to be honest about something. The version of this proposal that reached popular audiences is not the version that survives serious scrutiny. The Embodied Mind, the 1991 book Varela co-authored with Evan Thompson and Eleanor Rosch, did real damage along with its real contribution. It conflated different Buddhist traditions, Abhidharma, Madhyamaka, modern mindfulness, as if they were one body of teaching. It dismissed Western phenomenology too quickly, and it implied, in places, that meditation gives privileged access to the structure of the mind. In 2017, 26 years after the book first appeared, Evan Thompson, Varela's main collaborator and one of the leading philosophers working in this area, published a public reflection titled "The Embodied Mind in Hindsight." He named those three errors directly: overconfident dismissal of Western phenomenology, conflation of historically distinct Buddhist schools, implicit claim that meditative training delivers a special, more accurate kind of knowing. 3 years later, Thompson published a book called "Why I Am Not a Buddhist." The title is precise. Thompson treats Buddhist traditions as a serious source of phenomenological data, careful descriptions of mind, produced by people who spent lifetimes paying attention. He does not treat them as established metaphysical truth. He is a philosopher of mind who studies Buddhist material. He is not himself a Buddhist. That matters for honest framing of this episode. The most serious thinkers working at this intersection are not claiming that Buddhism solved what science cannot solve. They are claiming something more limited and more interesting, that the contemplative traditions produced a body of careful first-person investigation, and that any complete science of consciousness will have to take that body of investigation seriously, not as gospel, but as data. What remains after the self-correction is the original methodological proposal. The hard problem may not be solvable from the outside, but the inside of experience is also accessible, and it has been investigated with careful discipline for 2,500 years. That investigation is not the same as a scientific theory of consciousness. It is something different. It begins from inside the fact of experience and works from within it, not by explaining experience to someone who does not have it, but by refining what experience itself can disclose. That is what contemplative practice does. The question of whether it succeeds is a separate question. The point Varela was making is that there is a different door, and that door has been worked on for a long time, which is where the Pali Canon becomes relevant to this episode. Not as a theory that somehow preempted Chalmers. The Canon does not contain Chalmers' question. It does not contain any of the 4 theories we just walked through. But it does contain a different kind of investigation, one that began from the other side of the wall, and that has its own way of arriving at silence. The next chapter walks into that material directly. Chapter 3: What the Canon Says. The Canon's investigation begins not with metaphysics, but with practice. So before we look at what it says about consciousness, we have to start by understanding what the Buddha refused to say. The Buddha was asked, on more than one occasion, what we would now call metaphysical questions about consciousness. Is consciousness the same as the body, or different from the body? Does the awakened one exist after death, or not exist? These are exactly the kinds of questions the hard problem invites. Chalmers' question is structurally similar. What is the relationship between physical processing and felt experience? The Buddha refused to answer them. In MN63, the Kula Malukya Sutta, a monk named Malukya Putta becomes frustrated by this refusal and threatens to leave the Buddha's community if these questions are not addressed. The Buddha responds with a simile. Imagine a man wounded by a poisoned arrow. His friends and relatives call a surgeon. But the man says, I will not let this arrow be removed until I know who shot it, what his family name was, what kind of bow he used, what kind of arrowhead, what feathers were on the shaft. He would die, the Buddha says, and those things would still remain unknown to him. Then the Buddha gives the reason, in Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation, his exact words. Because they are not connected with the goal, are not fundamental to the holy life. They do not lead to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, calming, direct knowledge, self-awakening, unbinding. That's why they are undisclosed by me. Notice what kind of restraint this is. The Buddha is not saying he does not know. He is not saying the questions are meaningless. He is saying these questions do not tend toward liberation. The arrow is in the body. Theorizing about the arrow does not remove it. That matters for what follows. The Canon does not offer a theory of consciousness. This is not a failure. It is a deliberate choice. The Canon offers a path of investigation from within consciousness, a different undertaking from the one science has been pursuing. But the Canon does have something to say about what consciousness is not. In the Mahatanha Sankhya Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 38, MN 38, a monk named Sati makes a serious mistake. He goes around telling the other monks that he has understood the Buddha's teaching, and that the teaching is this, and I quote Thanissaro's translation directly. As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, it is just this consciousness that runs and wanders on, from birth to birth, not another. Sati believes the Buddha teaches a kind of soul, a self-identical consciousness that persists across lifetimes. The same consciousness moving from body to body, not another, not a new one each time, the same one. When the Buddha hears about this, he calls Sati in front of the community and asks him directly, "Is this what you understand me to be teaching?" Sati says yes. The Buddha's reply, exact. Haven't I, in many ways, said of dependently co-arisen consciousness? Apart from a requisite condition, there is no coming into play of consciousness. And then he walks through what dependent co-arising means for consciousness specifically. In Thanasaro's translation, consciousness that arises in dependence on the eye and forms is classified simply as eye consciousness. Consciousness that arises in dependence on the ear and sounds is classified simply as ear consciousness. The pattern continues through the other four senses. Nose consciousness arises in dependence on the nose and aromas. Tongue consciousness in dependence on the tongue and flavors. Body consciousness in dependence on the body and tactile sensations. And the sixth, which we would now call thinking, intellect consciousness, in dependence on the intellect and its objects, which the canon calls ideas. 6 classifications, 6 kinds of consciousness, named not by some inner essence, but by the conditions under which each arises. And then, the fire analogy. Just as fire is classified simply by whatever requisite condition in dependence on which it burns, a fire that burns in dependence on wood is classified simply as a wood fire. In the same way, consciousness is classified simply by the requisite condition in dependence on which it arises. A wood fire is not a different substance from a grass fire. There is no fire essence hiding inside both, waiting to come out. There's wood, oxygen, heat. When those conditions meet, you have a wood fire. Change the fuel, change the fire. There is no fire itself, independent of conditions. Consciousness, the Buddha is saying, is like that. There is no consciousness in itself. There is consciousness in dependence on eye and form. Consciousness in dependence on ear and sound. Consciousness in dependence on the intellect and its objects. Change the conditions, change the consciousness. Remove the conditions altogether, and consciousness in that mode does not arise. This is the canon's refutation of what we have been calling substance dualism. The idea that consciousness is a persistent, self-identical mental thing. It is also a refutation of soul theory in the form Sati had it, and it is incompatible with panpsychism in Goff's version. Goff's panpsychism says consciousness is a fundamental property present in all matter. The Buddha is saying consciousness is a dependently arisen process, present only when its conditions are present. 2 different claims. So the Buddhist view is not materialism, it is not soul theory, it is not panpsychism. What is it? The most precise structural answer in the Pali Canon comes not from the Buddha himself, but from one of his senior students, the monk Sariputta. In SN 1267, the Nalakalap Sutta, Sariputta is asked the question directly: what is the relationship between consciousness and the physical-mental complex, name and form, in the canon's vocabulary? Sariputta answers with one of the cleanest similes in the entire collection. In Thanasaro's translation, it is as if 2 sheaves of reeds were to stand leaning against one another. In the same way, from name and form as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. If one were to pull away one of those sheaves of reeds, the other would fall. If one were to pull away the other, the first one would fall. In the same way, from the cessation of name and form comes the cessation of consciousness. From the cessation of consciousness comes the cessation of name and form. 2 sheaves of reeds leaning against one another. Neither stands without the other. Neither produces the other unilaterally. They hold each other up. Take one away, the other falls. This is the relational structure. Consciousness does not produce the body. the way idealism would have it. The body does not produce consciousness, the way materialism would have it. They co-arise. Each is the condition for the other. This view does not match any standard Western philosophical category. It is not Cartesian dualism, where mind and body are two separate substances. It is not materialism, where mind is generated by body. It is not idealism, where body is generated by mind. It is not panpsychism, where mind is fundamental and ubiquitous. It is a fourth thing, a mutual, dependent, relational arising. And Western philosophy of mind has no exact term for it, which brings us to the most contested passage in this entire domain. The passage where the canon approaches the limit of what can be said about consciousness and stops. Dagha Nikaya 11, DN 11. The Kevada Sutta. The setup is a story. A monk has a question he cannot answer. He decides to take the question to higher beings, gods in the cosmology of the suttas. He travels through layer after layer of heavenly realms, asking the same question at each level. Where do the four great elements, water, earth, fire, wind, cease without remainder? No deity can answer. They keep referring him upward. Finally, he reaches the great Brahma, the highest god in this part of the cosmology. The monk asks the question publicly. Brahma gives a grand, evasive answer in front of his retinue. Then he pulls the monk aside, privately, and admits he does not know. He sends the monk back to ask the Buddha. The Buddha, when asked, says, "The question is wrongly framed." Then he gives the right question and answers it. In Thanisaro's translation, where do water, earth, fire, and wind have no footing? Where are long and short, coarse and fine, fair and foul, name and form brought to a stop without trace? And the answer to that is consciousness without surface, without end, luminous all around. Here, water, earth, fire, and wind have no footing. Here long and short, coarse and fine, fair and foul. Here name and form are all brought to a stop without trace. With the cessation of the aggregate of consciousness, each is here brought to a stop. This is one of the most striking passages in the entire canon, and it is also one of the most contested. The Pali phrase Thanissaro translates as consciousness without surface is Vijnanam Anidasanam. In his footnote to this very passage, Thanissaro opens with a striking line. This term is nowhere explained in the canon. It appears in two places, here and in a parallel passage at MN 49. MN 49. It is not defined. It is not unpacked. It is just used twice in this enigmatic verse form. That ambiguity has produced three different scholarly readings from three of the most respected translators working today. We are going to walk through all three. None of them is going to be presented as consensus. The disagreement is live and unresolved. The first reading is Thanissaro Bhikkhu's. He translates the phrase as consciousness without surface, or, alternately, consciousness without feature. His reading, this names a kind of awareness that lies outside the six sense media, outside the consciousness aggregate of dependent co-arising, outside space and time, associated with nibbana, but to be approached pragmatically, not theorized into a system. The second reading is Bhikkhu Bodhi's. Bodhi is the leading English translator of the Pali Canon for wisdom publications. He translates the parallel phrase in MN 49 as consciousness non-manifesting, boundless, luminous all around. But his reading of what it refers to is sharply different from Thanissaro's. Bodhi argues this passage describes the arahant's meditative experience of nibbana, not a kind of consciousness called nibbana. The distinction matters. For Bodhi, the verse is about what the awakened mind experiences when it knows the unconditioned. It is not saying that the unconditioned is a kind of consciousness. Bodhi is explicit in his footnote. Nowhere in the Pali Canon is nibbana ever described as consciousness. The third reading is associated with Bhikkhus Sujato and Brahmali, two scholars working out of Australia. Their reading is more deflationary still. The passage may not be describing anything mystical at all. It may simply be describing the formless meditative attainment of boundless consciousness, the second of the four formless jhanas, a deep meditative state in which awareness expands without object. On this reading, the verse is technical, not transcendent. 3 readings, 3 respected translators, the same passage, different conclusions about what it means. None has won the field. Here is what is important for this episode. Whatever the right reading is, notice what the passage does not say. It does not say consciousness is eternal. It does not say consciousness is the self. It does not say the Buddha solved the hard problem. It is one obscure verse in a vast canon that has been argued over for centuries. Thanissaro himself, in the same footnote, points to a passage at AN4:173. AN4:173, where the Buddha warns against trying to settle exactly this kind of question. Any speculation about what does or does not remain after the stopping of the 6 sense media, Thanissaro's phrase, is to objectify the non-objectified, which gets in the way of attaining the non-objectified. This is the same restraint we saw in MN63. The boundary itself is not to be made into a thing to argue about. It is to be approached and recognized, not cataloged. There is one more thing to say before we close this chapter, and it has to be said with care because it concerns a synthesis rather than a settled doctrine. Across multiple texts, MN38, MN49, DN11, and several others, Thanissaro Bhikkhu builds an interpretive reading that he calls, in shorthand, 2 kinds of consciousness. The first is vijnana as conditioned aggregate, the kind that arises dependent on the 6 sense media, the kind Sati misunderstood as a wandering soul. The second is vijnana anidasanam, consciousness without surface, which on Thanissaro's reading is a different kind of awareness outside the aggregate, outside space and time associated with unbinding. It needs to be said clearly. This is Thanissaro's interpretive synthesis across multiple texts. The canon nowhere lays out 2 kinds of consciousness as a single labeled doctrine. Bhikkhu Bodhi rejects this reading. Other scholars are skeptical. We are presenting it as one defensible interpretation, not as established Buddhist teaching. The honest label matters. What Thanissaro's synthesis offers, if it is right, is a frame for what the hard problem might be reaching toward in its own way, from the outside. The first kind of consciousness, the conditioned aggregate, is the one the 4 theories of the last chapter are trying to explain. The second kind, if there is such a thing, would be precisely what the hard problem has no category for. Not because it is missing from the theories, but because it is not the kind of object those theories are built to address. Thanissaro uses one image in particular for what the second kind of consciousness might be like. He draws it from the canon, from a simile at Samyutta Nikaya 1264. A sunbeam moving through empty space, bright in itself, illuminating nothing, not because the light is absent, the light is there, but because there is no surface for it to land on. a beam of light that does not land. That is the image. The canon, at its outermost edge, points towards something that cannot be photographed, cannot be measured, cannot be theorized into a system. It can, on the canon's account, be directly known, and if it can be known, the practice is what is oriented toward knowing it. But it cannot be described, and so here the canon stops. Chapter 4: The Convergence. So that is where the two sides of this episode have landed. Science on one side, the Pali Canon on the other. Both, for very different reasons, have stopped describing. Here is what I notice when I sit with these two bodies of material. Chalmers' hard problem and the canon on Vijnana, placed side by side. And I say, I notice, because this synthesis is mine. Chalmers has not engaged seriously with the Pali Canon in any of his published work. The canon had no category for the hard problem. The convergence I am about to describe is this episode's synthesis. It is not a historical dialogue. Neither Chalmers nor Thanissaro Bhikkhu has made this claim. I am making it. That has to be said out loud before it is said at all. Here it is. Science, applying its third-person method to consciousness, has arrived at a precisely named wall. Functional explanation, how the brain discriminates, integrates, broadcasts, accesses, cannot, by itself, entail phenomenal experience. The gap cannot be closed by adding more mechanism. Chalmers in 1995. The very fact that experience arises is the central mystery. 30 years on, the mystery is unmoved. The four theories of Chapter 1, global workspace, integrated information, Mysterianism, panpsychism, each explains something real, and each, in the end, leaves the same gap intact. That is the wall, named from the outside. The Pali Canon, applying its first-person investigation to consciousness, arrived at a different kind of restraint. Not a wall from the outside, a deliberate silence from the inside. MN63, MN63. Some questions do not tend toward liberation. The practice does not wait for a third-person theory. It works from within the fact of experience before any theory arrives. And at the boundary, DN11, Vijnanam Anidasanam, language stops, not because the answer is unknown, but because objectifying it would get in the way of what it points to. AN4, 173, AN4, 173. Any speculation about what does or does not remain at the limit is to objectify the non-objectified. The canon stops short of theorizing the boundary it points at. Neither side claims consciousness has been explained. Both decline to reduce it to mechanism, but they are declining from opposite directions. Science is outside, looking in. The canon is inside, looking at the limit of what can be described. That is the structural shape I notice. Same edge, approached from opposite sides. Neither side completes the picture. Neither side, on its own account, claims to. And the most rigorous voices on both sides, Chalmers from the science side, Thanissaro, and Bodhi from the canon, have been careful to say that. What Varela proposed, you will remember, is not that this edge can be crossed from one side or the other. He proposed that any adequate investigation must work simultaneously with first-person and third-person data, each constraining the other. Not a solution. A different methodology. Contemplative practice is one form of that first-person investigation. One that has been refined for 2,500 years. One that begins not by theorizing about experience, but by attending to it directly. That is what the canon has been pointing at in every passage we have looked at tonight. Not a theory of what consciousness is, a discipline of attending to what consciousness is doing, right here, before any theory arrives. The image we ended the last chapter on was Thanasaros, a sunbeam moving through empty space, bright in itself, illuminating nothing, not because the light is absent, because there is no surface for it to land on. That is the image I want to leave you with. Science, from outside, has spent 30 years looking for the surface where the sunbeam lands. It has not found one. The canon, from inside, suggests there may not be one to find, and that the looking in that direction is itself the obstruction. What there is, the canon says, is the light, bright in itself, not photographable, not theorizable, but on its own account knowable. The practice is what is oriented toward that knowing. For 9 episodes now, the pattern of this series has been the same. Science describes. The Buddha goes further. Tonight, for the first time, both science and the Buddha have arrived at the same threshold. Science. The hard problem cannot be solved from the outside. The gap between mechanism and experience has not closed in 30 years, and the field has begun, openly, to acknowledge that it may not close. The Buddha, some questions do not tend toward liberation, and at the boundary, the place where consciousness and the unconditioned approach each other, the canon falls deliberately silent. Both have reached the edge. The question is what lies beyond it. One more episode. Episode 10, Beyond.